Everybody knows weird old phrases. A lot of people say them without thinking. And then every now and then you find out one of them is tied to something so awful it kind of stops you in your tracks. That is what happened to me with the name Fanny Adams, because behind that old British phrase is an actual little girl, 8 years old, cheerful, chatty, known around her town. And what happened to her in 1867 was so brutal that people were still talking about it generations later, long after the details blurred and the joke survived. And honestly, that part bothers me, because imagine your whole life being reduced to a phrase people toss out when they mean nothing. So tonight, let's talk about who Fanny Adams actually was, what happened to her in the little Hampshire town of Alton, and why this case hit Victorian Britain like a lightning strike. Fanny Adams was born on April 30th, 1859 in Alton, Hampshire, England. She lived with her parents, Harriet and George Adams, and several siblings in Tenhouse Lane. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, watched each other, probably knew who had visitors before the visitors even knocked on the door. Small town energy. The 1800s version of people peeking through curtains. And by all accounts, Fanny stood out. She was described as tall, pretty, intelligent, lively, the kind of child who talked to people, smiled at people. One source says she seemed older than 8, which makes this whole story even more chilling, because you can just picture a little girl trying to act brave and grown up in a world that absolutely did not deserve the trust. Her best friend was another little girl named Minnie Warner, and they were always together. Fanny also had a younger sister, Lizzie. So on Saturday, August 24th, 1867, it should have just been one of those ordinary summer afternoons that vanish into nothing. Warm day, bright lights, kids bored in the garden. That is how so many of these stories start, and I hate that. The girls asked Harriet if they could go play near Flood Meadow, just a short walk from home. This was normal. That part matters. They had gone there before. The town felt safe. People had no real reason to imagine something monstrous was about to happen in broad daylight. And I think that is one of the hardest things to sit with in this case. Nobody was making some wild, reckless choice. This was not a horror movie setup. This was a mother in a quiet town letting children play nearby while she got on with housework. So Fanny, Minnie, and little Lizzie headed off. On the way, they ran into a man named Frederick Baker. He was 29, a solicitor's clerk, respectable job, respectable clothes, dark frock coat, light trousers, tall hat. The girls recognize him from church, which is such an ugly detail because it explains exactly why they didn't run. Familiar face, clean appearance, adult authority, that combination has fooled people forever. Now, some of the little details vary depending on the source. In one version, he had only been in town a couple of months, in another closer to a year. One source says he had clearly been drinking. Other accounts say witnesses later rejected the idea that he was drunk at all, so I want to be careful there. But the core of it stays the same. He started talking to the girls, gave them small coins, picked blackberries for them, watched them play. He made himself part of the afternoon. And then he tried to separate Fanny from the other two. First, he asked Fanny to walk with him toward Alton. She refused. Then he offered her money. Still no. Then he offered Minnie and Lizzie more money to go buy sweets, basically trying to peel them off from her. And this is the part that makes my skin crawl, because even now, even in modern cases, that same logic shows up again and again. Distraction, isolation, fake friendliness, tiny rewards. It feels sickeningly familiar. When that did not work, he stopped trying to charm them. He just picked Fanny up and carried her away into the hop field, in daylight, while the other two girls watched. Can you imagine being those children for even 1 second? You are small, you know something is wrong, but you also live in a world where adults are automatically more believable than you are. So, Minnie and Lizzie ran to tell Minnie's mother, Martha Warner. And here is one of those moments in history that hurts because it feels so human. She did not react the way we wish she had. She brushed it off. Not because she did not care. I think that's important. People hear that and immediately think, how could she not panic? But if you have spent your whole life in a place where child abductions basically do not happen, your brain reaches for the least terrifying explanation first. Kids are joking, kids are confused, kids are playing some silly game. People do that all the time. They do it now, even with way more awareness than they had then. So the girls, seeing an adult stay calm down too. And those lost hours feel unbearable in this story. They kept playing. Fanny was gone for hours. Around 5 o'clock, Lizzie headed home without her. A neighbor, Mrs. Gardner, noticed Fanny was missing and asked where she was. Lizzie told her what had happened, and unlike Martha, Mrs. Gardner understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. She took the child back to Harriet Adams and told her. At that point, Harriet and Mrs. Gardner went out searching and very quickly found Frederick Baker, alone. No Fanny. Mrs. Gardner asked what he had done with the child. His answer was cool, casual, insulting, in that maddening way guilty people sometimes sound in these stories. He claimed he had only given Fanny money for sweets and left her at the gate. Mrs. Gardner basically told him she ought to hand him over to the police, and Baker said she could do what she liked. The confidence is chilling. Maybe it came from social status, maybe he believed 2 women and a few children would never be enough to pin anything on him. Maybe he thought he had already hidden what he needed to hide. Whatever was going through his head, he was calm enough to stand there and talk. And that is terrifying in its own way. Harriet and Mrs. Gardner went home hoping, somehow, that Fanny would still turn up. She did not. As evening fell and there was still no sign of her, neighbors formed a search party and went through the meadows and hop fields. Then a laborer named Thomas Gates, a Crimean War veteran, found something so horrifying that even people who had seen war were shaken by it. He found the severed head of a child in the hop field. I'm not going into every graphic detail here because this was a real little girl, not a horror prop, but the attack of Fanny was extraordinarily violent. Her body had been mutilated and dismembered. Some parts were scattered, some were never recovered at all, and the whole town basically cracked open. Harriet collapsed trying to get word to her husband George, who was out playing cricket. He came home, grabbed a loaded shotgun, and set off looking for a killer before neighbors stopped him. And I know we are supposed to be calm, civilized, trust the process, all of that, but if I'm being honest, if somebody told me that about my child, you would have to physically restrain me too. No question, no speech, just immediate apocalypse. The next day, people searched everywhere. Too many people, really. Hundreds. Which probably damaged evidence because this was a tiny town full of horrified residents, not a controlled modern crime scene with tape and gloves and neat little numbered markers. Some of Fanny's clothing was found cut into pieces and scattered around the field. Her remains were gathered and taken in to be examined. A stone with hair and flesh on it was found and may have been the murder weapon. Some medical opinion at the time leaned toward Fanny having died from a crushing blow to the head. There were also knives involved in the investigation, and this is another place where the details get messy. Baker had 2 small knives on him when he was arrested. Some reports say they were unstained, others say one had blood on it. Testing later confirmed human blood, but experts also argued those knives alone were probably too small to do everything that had been done, so another weapon may have been used. That matters because this case is old, and old cases are like trying to assemble a shattered teacup with half the pieces missing and some Victorian guy in the corner insisting his notes are perfect. They usually were not. But again, the core does not change. Police knew very quickly who they were looking at. That same evening, Superintendent William Cheney went to Baker's workplace, a solicitor's office in Alton. Baker was there later than usual. He protested, claimed innocence. By then, a furious crowd had already gathered outside, and police had to get him out the back because people were ready to tear him apart. At the station, officers noticed blood on his clothing. His trousers had been soaked, seemingly to hide staining. His socks and lower clothing were wet too. And then he said one of those lines that is so creepy it almost sounds fake. He looked at the blood and said, "Well, I don't see a scratch or cut on my hands to account for the blood. Sir, that is not the helpful observation you think it is. That is the kind of thing a person says in a movie right before everybody in the audience points at the screen and yells. Then, police search his desk and find the diary. And this is the piece people always remember. The entry for the day reportedly read, "Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot." It is so blunt that it almost short-circuits your brain. Just stick there with the weather out. Now, Baker later tried to wriggle around this in court. His defense argued the wording was being misunderstood, that it fit the way he wrote, that it did not prove a confession in the most literal sense. So yes, technically his lawyers pushed back on that interpretation. But come on, if you write that on the day a child is murdered after you were seen taking her away with blood on your clothes while carrying knives, the diary entry is not exactly doing you any favors. The investigation kept going. A young boy eventually came forward saying he had seen Baker after the killing near the river with blood on his hands and clothing, washing himself and what looked like small objects, possibly knives. The frustrating part is that the boy has told his mother earlier, but she had not reported it right away. Again, deeply human. People hesitate, they doubt, they worry about being wrong, and sometimes those delays become part of the tragedy. Baker's defense later tried a few angles. One was insanity. There was a family history they could point to. Violence, asylum stays, a sister who had died after mental illness, a previous suicide attempt by Baker himself after a failed romance. Even the judge allowed the jury to consider whether he might be legally insane. The jury did not buy it. And I think this is one of those places where people can land in different spots. Some will hear the background and wonder whether something deeply broken was going on in his mind. Others say none of that changes what he did or how deliberately parts of it seem. I can understand why people argue both sides. The court, though, came down hard on one answer. After just 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Frederick Baker guilty of murdering Fanny Adams. 15 minutes. There is barely enough time to make a coffee and regret the coffee. He was sentenced to death. On Christmas Eve, 1867, Frederick Baker was hanged outside Winchester Prison before a crowd of around 5,000 people, many of them women and children. That detail feels very Victorian in the worst possible way. Public execution, a spectacle. Grief, rage, punishment, curiosity, all mixed together in one freezing crowd. Before his death, Baker reportedly wrote to Fanny's parents asking forgiveness and expressing sorrow for what he had done in an unguarded hour. He also denied violating the child. Some sources repeat the denial clearly, but whatever exact wording he used, the letter does not soften anything. If anything, it leaves you with one more ugly piece of a man trying to explain the inexplicable. Fanny was buried in Alton cemetery. Her headstone was paid for by public subscription. People in the town did not want her forgotten. And here is where the story takes its strangest, bleakest turn. A couple of years later, British sailors were given new tins of preserved mutton. They hated it, thought it was disgusting, and in one of those jokes that makes you stare at the wall for a second, they started calling it Fanny Adams, comparing the chopped meat in the tins to the remains of the murdered child. That phrase stuck. Over time, sweet Fanny Adams drifted away from the crime itself and became slang for worthless leftovers, then practically nothing at all, and eventually a mince oath people still say. And this is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Did the phrase preserve her name? Yes, sort of. Did it preserve her as a person? Not really. That is a different thing. Some people feel the phrase should die because its origin is grotesque and cruel. Other people argue that if the phrase disappears, so does one of the last things still pulling people back toward the real story of Fanny Adams. I actually get both reactions, I really do. One feels respectful, the other feels weirdly practical. But there's still something chilling about a bright little girl from a small Hampshire town becoming shorthand for nothing. Nothing. When she was a whole person. A child with a best friend, a sister, a daughter, a kid who talked to neighbors on the street. And that is the part that stays with me much more than the phrase does. So, I want to know what you think. When you hear where Sweet Fanny Adams came from, does it make you want the phrase gone completely? Or do you think the fact people still say it has, in a strange, messed up way, kept her from being erased? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more dark historical cases like this, make sure you like, subscribe and tell me what to cover next, because I have a whole list and honestly it is getting slightly out of hand in the best way.